So you've heard of the ancient Greek symposium. Maybe you're picturing a bunch of tunic-clad men reclining on cushions, sipping wine and debating philosophy while a flute girl plays softly in the background. Sounds relaxing, right? But, like most things in history that sound pleasant, it absolutely wasn't. Because ancient Greek drinking parties weren't just parties, they were tests of wit, of charm, of status. These gatherings were formal, competitive, deeply ritualized events, somewhere between a frat house, a secret society, and a TED Talk. But hey, you're here now, so dim the lights, pour yourself a little something diluted, and get comfortable. And if you enjoy calming, weirdly specific explorations of history's more chaotic moments, give the video a like, maybe even subscribe. And while you're at it, tell me in the comments, what's keeping you up tonight? This is the Sleep Atlas, and tonight we're going to party like it's 499 BCE. Chapter 1. You, the underprepared guest. Picture this. You've been invited to a party. Not just any party. This is the party of parties. The kind that gets whispered about afterward in the marketplace. The kind that poets reference in scandalous verses that definitely aren't about you, except they are. You're flattered, of course. Someone important noticed you. Maybe it was your cousin who has a little status. Maybe you impressed someone at the gymnasium. Doesn't matter. The scroll arrives, an invitation to a symposium, tonight. And you panic, not outwardly. Outwardly you do the whole, oh, a symposium, how quaint, just a few intellectuals chatting over diluted wine thing, but inside, you're sweating. Because you've never actually been to one of these before. You've heard the stories, the rules, the games, the poems, the toasts, the judgment. You try to prepare. You pick out your cleanest chiton, still smells faintly of olive oil and disappointment. You skip the sandals with the busted strap. You even pluck a few sprigs of laurel to wear, hoping it passes as a garland. It doesn't. You look like you lost a fight with a shrub. Then you arrive. Late. Not fashionably late. Just slightly too late to be impressive, but not late enough to be mysterious. The door slave gives you a long look, the kind that silently communicates, "Oh, you're new." You try to make a joke. He doesn't laugh. Inside, the room glows with oil lamps. Couches line the perimeter in a semicircle. At the far end, the host greets guests with the warm indifference of someone who knows exactly where everyone ranks and has already assigned seats accordingly. You realize quickly there are no name cards, but the hierarchy is obvious. You're shown to a couch near the door. Not the worst spot, but close. The airflow from outside is chilly, and the seat is slightly damp from a spilled libation. You sit anyway. You're now part of the evening. Welcome. You glance around. Everyone else is already reclining in that perfect, effortless slouch that says, "I do this every weekend." They're draped in more garland than you thought possible. Their feet are clean. Their laughter is just loud enough to be heard, but not loud enough to be labeled unrefined. You try to lean back and look casual. Your elbow slides off the armrest. You cough. Someone notices. You look away. The wine arrives. Well, not wine exactly, not as you know it. This is wine that's been carefully diluted in the crater, the communal mixing bowl. No one drinks it straight. That would be barbaric or Spartan. Same difference. You're handed a kylix, a wide, shallow cup with handles. Elegant, mockable if you hold it wrong. Your first sip is cautious. It's lukewarm, slightly sour. You smile and nod like you understand the blend. You don't. Then come the toasts. This part's tricky. The host or the designated symposiarch raises his cup. Everyone else follows. There's a brief pause. A name is invoked, a god perhaps, or a notable ancestor. You raise your cup a moment too late, toast the wrong person, and sip too early. It's fine. You're probably fine. People are watching. They're not being obvious, but you can feel it. The guy 2 seats down with the gold armlet, he raised an eyebrow when you flubbed that last toast. The man across the room, reclining with the flute girl on one side and a philosopher on the other, he's made a mental note of your sandals. You're now that guy with the sad feet. Conversation flows, sort of. It's more like a performance with rotating acts. Someone recites a poem. Someone else offers a biting critique of a recent court ruling. You try to contribute, maybe a witty remark about the weather in Delos, but it dies somewhere around your molars. You laugh at the wrong time. It echoes. Then come the games. The host calls for kotobos, a cup-flinging contest. It's harder than it sounds. You're supposed to swirl the wine dregs in your kylix, aim, and fling the last drops at a target. Usually a small dish. Sometimes someone's face, if you're brave. You go for the dish. You miss. The wine lands in someone's lap. Someone important. You apologize. They shrug. But it's the kind of shrug that says, you'll never be invited again. You look for a place to disappear. There isn't one. Just more wine, more poems, and more judgment wrapped in smiles. The evening continues. Someone improvises a verse about love. Someone else counters with a bawdy tale. The flute girl plays a haunting melody in Dorian mode. You try to relax. You fail. By midnight, you've given up trying to impress anyone. You focus on not spilling your next cup. A small victory. And yet, oddly, you're still here. Despite the mistakes, despite the wreath, despite the accidental insult to someone's mother via misquoted poetry, you've made it through the first round. You're no Alcibiades. You're no Socrates. You're not even that guy who brings the really good honey cakes. But you're still on the couch, and in a symposium that counts. Now let's get you a refill. Don't worry, it gets weirder from here. Let's talk about the wine. Or rather, let's talk about how wrong your expectations probably are. Because if you're imagining ruby red, full-bodied, room temperature Mediterranean wine being served in sophisticated silence while flute music dances in the background, well, parts of that are true, but only parts. First of all, ancient Greek wine wasn't served straight. That would have been scandalous, vulgar, practically criminal. Drinking undiluted wine was a sign of poor breeding, bad manners, or worse, being a Thracian, and no one wanted to be mistaken for a Thracian, bless their rowdy little barbarian hearts. So the first thing to know is that moderation, at least in appearance, was a cultural imperative. Now, this didn't mean the Greeks were trying to be boring. They absolutely still got drunk, but they preferred to take the scenic route. Here's how it worked. The wine came in concentrated form, thick, heady, sometimes syrupy. It was stored in amphorae, those familiar ceramic jugs you've seen 100 times in museums or awkwardly leaning against a digital backdrop in video games. From there, it was poured into the crater, the wide-mouthed mixing bowl at the center of the room, perched on a tripod or a block of stone, looking a bit like a holy altar. And in a way, it was. Because this bowl, it was the beating heart of the symposium. The host, or more often the designated symposiarch, controlled the crater. He was the wine master, the dilution dictator, the arbiter of everyone's future embarrassment. If he wanted a thoughtful, philosophical evening, he'd order a high water-to-wine ratio, say 3 parts water to 1 part wine. If he wanted an evening that devolved into singing contests and people climbing furniture, he might tilt the ratio toward chaos, 2-1, or worse, but never, ever undiluted. The Greeks believed that straight wine was for gods and madmen. Dionysus could handle it. You, mortal guest reclining awkwardly near the door with questionable garlands and a foot cramp? Not so much. Drinking it straight would have been seen as an act of defiance, or worse, of not knowing the rules. And then there was the water itself. This wasn't casually drawn from a nearby faucet. No, the water was often cooled with snow or drawn from particular springs known for their taste, which is a polite way of saying some sources were preferable to others and probably less full of floating surprises. Sometimes herbs or perfumes were added, bay leaves, resin, even seawater if you were feeling particularly bold or came from a coastal town with strong opinions about flavor. All of this turned the act of drinking into a ritual. You weren't just sipping to get a buzz, you were engaging in an aesthetic experience, one with layers of symbolism, status, and subtle jabs. Your cup wasn't just a cup, it was a statement, and how you held it, how much you drank, when you toasted, and what you said while holding it. These were all social signals, tiny threads in the intricate web of symposium etiquette, which brings us to the cup itself. The kylix, the classic shallow drinking vessel, was a bit of a prank. Beautifully made, often painted with elaborate scenes from mythology, but shallow and wide enough that any sudden hand movement could lead to catastrophe. It encouraged graceful sipping, it discouraged gesticulating wildly mid-rant, and it made sure that everyone knew if your hand trembled just a little too much from nerves or overindulgence. And then there was the hidden art. Many kylix, that's the plural for kylix if you're curious and want to impress someone at a museum, had little surprises painted at the bottom. As you drank, the image would slowly reveal itself. A dancing satyr, a woman playing a lyre, Dionysius lounging on a ship of vines. By the time you reached the bottom, you might find yourself laughing or blushing, depending on what the artist had hidden there, which meant drinking itself became a slow-motion magic trick, unwrapping a private joke one sip at a time. But you're still getting used to the taste. The wine is thin, slightly sour, not at all like the sweet stuff from that corner shop near your apartment. It's cool, though not cold. There's a hint of resin, a whisper of something herbal. You swirl it carefully. You take your time. You try to pretend that you're discerning the subtle terroir of a vineyard near Corinth when, in reality, you're wondering if it's okay to ask for bread. It's not, or at least not yet. Food was often served before the symposium, not during. Once the drinking began, it was mostly about the wine, and the conversation, and the games, and the increasingly tense awareness that every time you reach for your cup, someone across the room is mentally judging your wrist posture. So you pace yourself, one cup, then another, and already you feel a little warmer, a little looser. The flute music isn't so intimidating anymore. You manage to nod at the right time during a story about someone's trip to Delos. You smile at a joke about philosophers, though you don't entirely get it. Something about Socrates and a goat. Your cup is refilled. You glance at the crater. It's been stirred again. The ratio might have changed. You're not sure, but you feel it. The room is a touch louder. The laughter lasts a little longer. Someone claps too hard. You're still trying to figure out if that means the evening is going well or about to go wildly off script. In ancient Athens, the line between a thoughtful discussion and a Dionysian disaster was always a thin one, and it usually came down to what was floating in that crater. For now, though, you sip, you smile, you laugh carefully, and you wonder how many more cups you can handle before the poems start. Spoiler, not many. By now you've had your second or third cup of heavily diluted wine, or maybe fourth. Hard to say. Your kylix has been discreetly topped off whenever you weren't paying attention. The room has taken on a gentle sway like a ship at anchor, bobbing just slightly. Or maybe that's just your head. You're not drunk, not quite, but you're in that dangerous in-between space, just tipsy enough to feel bold, not yet inebriated enough to stop caring about social expectations, which unfortunately is the absolute worst place to be when someone proposes a game. Let's be clear, you're not at a frat party. No one's drawing a mustache on you or challenging you to shotgun an amphora. These are intellectuals, philosophers, statesmen, men in sandals who quote Homer without irony. But they still want to play, and the games they play, equal parts elegant, absurd, and terrifying. Take Kottabos, for instance. Imagine sitting cross-legged on a couch, holding your shallow wine cup delicately, and being told that the next part of the evening involves flinging the dregs of your drink across the room to hit a small target, a saucer floating in a larger bowl of water perhaps, or a bronze disc balanced precariously on a stand. Yes, with your wine, with your wrist. Precision required, grace preferred, dignity optional. You swirl the remaining sip around the base of your kylix, grip the stem and try to execute the flick just so, hoping the arc is poetic rather than pitiful. The goal? Hit the target, make a splash, get a laugh, and ideally impress someone important without staining their hymation. The Kottabos arena is unofficial, usually a cleared space in the center of the room or near the wall. There's often cheering, sometimes jeering, and always that sense of subtle one-upmanship, as if hitting the saucer proves not just coordination but character, or luck, or divine favor. And then comes the poetry. Because what pairs better with airborne wine than impromptu verse? The rules vary depending on the host. Some symposiums opt for recitations, classic lines from Sappho or Archilochus, delivered with a dramatic sigh or knowing smirk. Others demand improvisation. You're expected to compose something on the spot, funny, poignant, suggestive, or a mix of all three. A theme is announced, love, or the sea, or the nature of virtue. You're nudged to speak. All eyes turn to you, the guest who hasn't yet said anything memorable. You clear your throat, you stall, you try to remember that one fragment of a Hesiod poem you skimmed once in school. It comes out mangled, half-remembered, embarrassingly modern, and yet applause. Polite, merciful applause. This is the trick of the symposium. It isn't about being the best speaker. It's about performing just well enough to be interesting, just badly enough to be disarming, and never arrogant enough to provoke an actual philosopher into correcting you mid-sentence. The atmosphere teeters between witty and ruthless. A clever joke can make you a hero. A misstep, a misquote, or an awkward pause can turn you into a cautionary tale. And then there are the scholia, drinking songs. These are short, often bawdy verses passed from one guest to the next like a baton. You're expected to continue the theme, rhyme when possible, and definitely not repeat anything said earlier. Here's a song about a woman with a lyre, someone begins. Her hands were swift, her music fire. You're up next. You panic. You mutter something about desire and hope no one noticed the rhyme felt forced. Too late. A ripple of chuckles passes around the circle. Not cruel, exactly, but unmistakably smug. You refill your cup. By now, the crater has been stirred again. The mixture leans a little heavier on the wine. The edges of conversation are fraying. People are reclining more than sitting. A few togas have loosened. Someone starts dancing, someone else pretends they're asleep. You think they might actually be asleep. Through it all, the games continue. Witty one-liners tossed like javelins, toasts made to distant cities, to old lovers, to questionable gods. Someone recites a parable about a frog and a scorpion, but they confuse the ending, and it becomes more confusing than illuminating. Still, the laughter is warm, the ridicule gentle, and despite your early fumbles, no one's asked you to leave, which is a kind of victory. Eventually, a new challenge is issued, a philosophical riddle, something about justice and soup. You try to follow, but the room is humming now, soft and golden, like a hive of drowsy bees. You nod politely, you sip again. You try not to knock over the lamp when you shift your weight. There's no scoreboard at a symposium, no official winner, just the soft hierarchy of who spoke well, who held their wine, and who managed to keep their dignity while pretending they didn't care what anyone thought. You're doing fine. Not brilliant, not disastrous. Somewhere in the safe middle, which, in ancient Athens, is often the wisest place to be. Let's talk about the crater again, because while it may have seemed like just a ceramic bowl full of wine earlier, it was actually the quiet tyrant of the room, the host's little agent of chaos, moderation, or philosophical ambition. More than just a mixing vessel, the crater was a kind of sacred fulcrum, dictating the mood, pace, and ultimate direction of the entire evening. It sat there, calmly, innocently, in the middle of the sympathetic circle, wide-mouthed, deep-bellied, usually elaborately painted with scenes of revelry, mythology, or Dionysian imagery, because even in ancient times people liked their party decor on theme. But it wasn't just decoration, it was authority embodied in ceramic and constantly watched. You, as a guest, never pour directly from the crater. That would be absurd, blasphemous even. Instead, a slave or servant, sometimes called an oinochous, used a ladle to dip into the crater and pour your portion into a smaller vessel, often a jug or directly into your kylix. That means you, reclining on your cushion, were always at the mercy of someone else's decision-making. You didn't control how strong the drink was, or how often your cup was refilled, or whether this round would be light and conversational, or the start of a philosophical shouting match followed by impromptu dance. That authority came from the symposiarch, the evening's chosen or sometimes self-appointed leader. His job? To determine the crater's mix ratio and set the tone. 3 parts water, 1 part wine meant a night of poetry and discussion. 2-to-1 meant things might get rowdy. 1-to-1. That's when you quietly made excuses to leave before someone jumped onto the table or tried to explain politics with interpretive dance. Choosing the dilution wasn't just about taste or strength, it was about message. A weaker mix implied restraint, civility, intellectualism. A stronger mix, hedonism, escapism, or just that the host wanted to impress his guests with imported wine and wasn't worried about consequences. And yes, there were consequences. Let the ratio slip too far in one direction, and suddenly the entire party becomes unmanageable. Voices rise, conversations devolve into arguments, flute music turns chaotic. Somebody starts singing the wrong verse of a hymn to Apollo and insists it's Dionysian. The poet in the corner begins weeping for no reason. Your neighbor falls asleep mid-toast, face down in a plate of leftover olives, all thanks to the crater. But when managed well, it was a tool of astonishing social precision. A well-balanced crater could encourage just the right level of tipsiness, enough to loosen inhibitions, draw out interesting thoughts, inspire poetry, provoke clever repartee, and possibly result in a friendly flirtation with the person across the room who's been quoting Euripides under their breath all evening. In some ways, the crater acted like a thermostat for the collective emotional temperature. If people were tense, it could be mixed lighter. If the gathering was slow to start, the mix could be stronger. The symposiarch was essentially tuning the vibe, a human playlist using alcohol instead of songs. This also meant the crater was a power symbol. Who got to control it? Not the most drunk, certainly, and usually not the most modest. The symposiarch was often someone with social clout, maybe the host himself or a guest of honor, someone whose judgment was trusted, or at least someone who could fake leadership long enough to mix a decent bowl and keep the room from dissolving into brawls. Once the ratio was chosen, it wasn't necessarily permanent. The crater was periodically refreshed, and each round was a chance to shift the balance. This round, a bit more restrained. Next round, let's get brave, but always within boundaries. No one wanted to be the party where someone tried to recite all of Homer backwards or leapt into a brazier thinking it was a fountain. And while you're keeping your eyes on the symposiarch and your cup half full, don't forget that the crater had a kind of spiritual role too. Before drinking began, a small libation, usually a few drops of wine, was offered to the gods, poured gently onto the ground, sometimes accompanied by a short prayer. It was a way of honoring Dionysus and the divine permission that made drinking not just acceptable, but meaningful. Without that offering, the night lacked legitimacy. You were just a bunch of men getting drunk in a tiled room. With the offering, it was culture, a ritual, a sacred tradition. So there's the paradox. This great bowl in the center of it all, painted with dancing satyrs, filled with spiced and perfumed wine, passed between philosopher and soldier, lover and enemy. It represented both indulgence and restraint. It could make you feel powerful or make you embarrass yourself in front of your political rivals, sometimes both in the same evening. By now, you've learned to eye the crater with respect. When your cup is refilled, you murmur a quiet thanks to the oinachus and try to gauge whether the ratio has shifted. The conversation feels warmer, a little blurrier around the edges. The flute player has switched to a slower tune. Someone is arguing softly about whether virtue can be taught. You recline a little further back on your cushion and wonder how many more rounds this crater has in it. Hopefully just enough. Somewhere between the third and fifth refill, it happens. The shift. A gentle slouch in posture. A bit more laughter echoing off the frescoed walls. A few guests beginning to recline sideways rather than upright. It's not chaos yet, not even close, but the symposium has moved firmly into what might be called the floaty phase. Everything feels a little warmer, a little funnier, and if you squint, even the oil lamps seem to be flickering in rhythm with the music. And then someone sings, not a rehearsed song, not a scullion passed down for generations, just a spontaneous tune about a neighbor's mule or a philosopher's nose or something scandalous involving a priestess. It doesn't quite scan, and the melody wanders, but people chuckle and nod along. Another man joins in, then another. Now it's practically a chorus, and you've either got to contribute a verse or pretend to choke on your olive. You try a line. Something about the crater spilling its secrets. It barely rhymes. Someone claps anyway. This is the part of the night where boundaries loosen, but not vanish. Let's be clear, the symposium wasn't a free-for-all. Despite the wine and the poetry and the occasional flute girl leaning into her scales a bit too sensually, there were still unspoken rules. Layers of etiquette you could break without realizing, especially once tipsy. Talk too much, you'd be seen as trying too hard. stay silent too long, clearly boring, laugh at the wrong moment, uncouth, laugh too hard, desperate, and so you begin to do the worst thing a guest can do, overthink. You become hyper-aware of your gestures, your words, the angle at which you're holding your kylix. Are you slouching too much? Did you interrupt the man quoting Euripides? Did your joke about the Oinochu's land, or was that a polite cough? Judgment at symposiums didn't always come in the form of open ridicule. It came in glances, raised brows, the subtle rotation of a guest's shoulders away from you, signaling that they'd rather engage the man to your left. It came when someone changed the subject mid-sentence, or when your offered toast was met with tepid nods and an awkward clearing of throats. Of course, all this was filtered through the haze of wine, which helped a little, but the real challenge, maintaining balance, because this wasn't a wild Dionysian riot, not yet. You were still expected to maintain poise, to banter, to quote, to listen, and occasionally to dazzle. The party was performance, and like any performance, it came with critics, the kind who remembered your worst lines long after they'd forgotten your name. And yet, oddly, it was all part of the fun. The strange, ritualized pressure of the symposium was exactly what made it work. The subtle competitiveness of wit, the thrill of saying just the right thing, the tiny social victories when someone chuckled or leaned in closer or nodded thoughtfully at your philosophical musing about whether birds understood justice. This was the ancient Greek social crucible, not the marketplace, not the battlefield, not even the courtroom, but this, here in the dim light of a tiled room, on wine-soaked cushions, surrounded by men quoting Homer and reaching for the olives with too much confidence. This was where reputations were sharpened, where alliances could be kindled, where flirtations smoldered and grudges were fermented like last season's grapes. You, meanwhile, are sweating slightly, not just from the warmth of the wine, but from the realization that the flute girl is now making direct eye contact with you. Or maybe she's looking at the crater behind you. You can't tell. You smile awkwardly. She looks away. You're unsure whether it was a flirtation or a signal to fix your toga. Either way, you're exhausted. The cushions have begun to feel like they're absorbing you. The air smells like figs, myrrh, and faintly of someone's sandal. The voices around you blend into one soft buzz. You blink slowly, holding your kylix with the careful precision of someone who knows that spilling wine here is more than a party foul. It's a minor act of social treason. You're surviving, barely. And now the host is raising his cup again. Another toast, something about the bravery of soldiers, or maybe lovers, or possibly sheep. The room toasts back, and you echo the movement just a beat too late. A few people glance your way again, not judging exactly, just noticing. This right here is the real secret of the symposium. It wasn't about drunkenness, not really. It was about the dance of appearances. You had to be drunk enough to let go, but sober enough to perform, loose enough to amuse, but still sharp enough to be sharp, carefree, but never careless. And that's why you couldn't handle it. Because it wasn't just a party. It was a social minefield, a poetry slam, a theology debate, and a drinking contest, all rolled into one, and all under the watchful eye of every other guest, each of whom was trying just as hard as you not to seem like they were trying at all. So as the evening rolls into its next phase, when the games become wilder, the music stranger, and the ideas more grandiose, you recline a little more, tip your head back, and sigh. You've made it through your first symposium segment. Barely, and there's still a whole night to go. Chapter 2. The Rise and Fall of Alcibiades. Imagine being so handsome, so charming, and so infuriatingly confident that even your political enemies couldn't stop talking about you. Now imagine being raised in the cultural petri dish of 5th century BCE Athens, a place that rewarded oratory, beauty, military prowess, and a good party anecdote, and being good at all of it. That's Alcibiades. And honestly, if there was ever a man tailor-made for the symposium scene, it was him. Alcibiades was the kind of figure who seemed to slip past normal rules, born into wealth, groomed for greatness, and trained in rhetoric by none other than Socrates himself. He was a man of paradoxes, beautiful but dangerous, cultured but reckless, gifted, yes, but also deeply, profoundly exhausting. Let's rewind a little. Alcibiades was born around 450 BCE to a noble Athenian family, part of that shimmering elite who had both money and pedigree. His father died when he was still a boy, and so his guardianship passed to none other than Pericles, the statesman who basically redesigned democracy in his spare time. So right out of the gate, Alcibiades had connections, power babysitters, political godfathers, and that was just the start. From a young age he dazzled, even in a society where sharp tongues and sharper looks were the currency of status. Alcibiades stood out. His beauty was the kind poets whispered about. There were stories about him refusing to wear a mouthguard while wrestling because he thought it made him look silly. He would rather risk losing teeth than compromise the image. This was a man who understood optics. He was educated in the classics, trained in military arts, and steeped in the rituals of Athenian elite life, including, of course, the symposium. In fact, it was in this world of reclining cushions and craters of wine where Alcibiades often shone brightest, and where he started to become a living legend. But before the scandals, the exile, and the increasingly erratic political decisions that would make him infamous, Alcibiades was Athens' star child, a glittering, frustrating symbol of potential. People either wanted to be him, sleep with him, or stab him, sometimes all three. His early political career looked promising. He was eloquent, ambitious, and knew how to work a crowd. He could sway the assembly with a carefully timed pause or a witty jab, and when he walked through the agora, even grizzled philosophers found themselves watching just a little too long. And yet, for all his charm, there was always a sense that Alcibiades was a little too aware of himself, a little too in love with the mirror, not metaphorically, literally. He was known for his vanity and for being theatrical to the point of parody. He would show up to public events in robes dyed with the rarest colors, or bring a pet quail into court, which then escaped and disrupted the entire proceedings, while Alcibiades casually retrieved it without missing a beat in his speech. And still, people loved him. He was untouchable, or so it seemed, because under all that glamour, all that charisma, was a man driven by ego and a compulsive need to be admired. A man who would not only burn bridges, but do so while giving a speech on bridge engineering. His behavior was tolerated, encouraged even, because people believed in his potential. He was, after all, a brilliant military strategist. He won battles, he inspired troops, he made Athens look good, and for a while that was enough. But ambition is a tricky thing, especially when paired with wine. And it was at symposiums, those intimate and chaotic social arenas, where Alcibiades truly thrived. There he could perform, dazzle, seduce, provoke. He could use a toast to launch a political campaign, a poem to bury a rival, a drunken joke to test the waters of scandal. Symposiums were where he tested his audience and the limits of their patience. Because behind all the flirtation and philosophy was a sharper edge. Alcibiades knew how to read a room. He could be deferential to elders and biting to equals. He could mimic a speech, exaggerate a lisp, turn the crowd on a dime. His power wasn't just in his looks or his lineage, it was in his timing, and yet that same timing would eventually betray him. The same social instincts that helped him rise would slowly begin to fray. Because when you live in the spotlight, when your charm becomes expected, when your wit becomes predictable, when people start to wait for you to overstep, sympathy erodes. Admiration turns to irritation, laughter into eye rolls. And Alcibiades? He couldn't stop performing, not even when the stakes were about to rise higher than even he could handle. We'll get to that soon. The scandals, the political betrayals, the dramatic entrances, and even more dramatic exits. But for now, picture him reclining at a symposium, cup in hand, tunic askew, just enough to be considered stylishly rebellious. He's telling a story, something risque, probably exaggerated, and the room is hanging on every word. He smiles. He knows exactly how this looks, and he loves it. Let's take a moment to appreciate just how strange, strategic, and seductive the Athenian symposium really was. This wasn't your average party. This was a chessboard soaked in wine, a ritualized social arena where reputation, philosophy, flirtation, and political scheming all clinked kylixes under the soft light of oil lamps. And Alcibiades turned this into performance art. He understood the rules of the symposium, knew them intimately, but what made him dangerous was how often he bent them just enough to surprise people without snapping them entirely. He didn't just attend symposiums, he dominated them, like a lion reclining on a velvet cushion. Let's be clear, this was a man who knew exactly what he was doing. At the symposium, hierarchy mattered. The guest list was curated with as much care as the wine list. Guests were seated by rank, status, or favor. The more important you were, the further you reclined from the door. The closer to the host, the higher your social standing. Alcibiades always managed to end up near the host, always. It wasn't just about proximity to power, it was about optics. He made entrances that people noticed. His clothes were crisp, often flamboyant. His voice was perfectly modulated. He'd pause before speaking just long enough for everyone to notice he hadn't spoken yet. And when he did speak, oh, he had lines. He could quote Euripides, twist a proverb, improvise a toast, or throw out a challenge so provocatively phrased it practically begged for flirtation or philosophical debate. But he also knew when to go quiet, when to let the room hang in silence after someone else's toast, when to glance sideways and smirk just enough to shift attention without saying a word. This wasn't luck, this was orchestration. Symposiums were ripe with opportunity, not just for pleasure, but for influence. Political alliances could be forged or fractured over a shared amphora. A seemingly harmless joke could carry pointed barbs about rival factions. A witty toast could double as a campaign slogan. And Alcibiades? He wielded the symposium like a general wielding terrain. He flirted with both men and women, but in ways that blurred the line between seduction and diplomacy. The courtesans, hetairai, were performers in their own right, and Alcibiades danced among them with the same ease he applied to generals and philosophers. He knew how to charm, how to hint, how to project vulnerability while remaining above reproach. Imagine a gathering where everyone is trying to impress one another, where words are weapons, wine is social lubricant, and gossip flows as freely as the vintage. And then imagine someone who seems effortlessly better at all of it. That was the effect Alcibiades had. People followed him not just because he was persuasive, but because he made persuasion look fun. Of course, all of this made him dangerous. The older statesmen, Socrates included, saw it. They admired him, but warily. They knew charm could sour into manipulation, that quick wit could cover deep ambition, and Alcibiades was ambitious, ferociously so. He wasn't content to merely entertain at symposiums. He wanted to be remembered. And let's not forget, this wasn't a culture shy about speaking its mind. Athens loved to debate, loved to poke holes in arguments, loved to cut down the mighty with one well-placed anecdote. But Alcibiades was slippery. Criticize him too directly and he'd beat you to it with a joke. Try to ignore him and he'd steal the room back with a story or a scandalous pose or an offhand comment about how quiet things were tonight. He was exhausting, yes, but also magnetic. He could flatter without seeming obsequious. He could insult without seeming cruel. And when he got someone drunk enough to start talking politics, he'd listen with the patience of a priest and the eyes of a predator. The symposium for him was a mirror. He could reflect whatever the guest opposite needed to see. A conspirator, a romantic rival, a lost soul seeking truth. He was the man who always seemed a little more alive than everyone else in the room. But with that brilliance came arrogance, and a creeping sense among the Athenian elite that maybe, just maybe, this young lion was beginning to think the party revolved around him. And sometimes it did. There's a reason why so many ancient texts, even centuries later, describe Alcibiades at symposiums, why he became the subject of gossip, of drama, of philosophy, why Plato didn't just mention him in passing, he gave him a full, unforgettable scene, but that's for the next segment. For now, picture him again, reclined, one arm draped over the back of a cushion, wine swirling slowly in a shallow cup, half listening to a rival's toast with a smile so subtle it's almost a dare. He's not just drinking, he's hunting, and everyone knows it. Now, if Alcibiades had simply been a charismatic golden boy who flirted a little too hard and drank a little too much, we probably wouldn't still be talking about him 24 centuries later. But no, he had to crash one of the most famous dinner parties in all of Western philosophy and steal the show. Let's set the stage. It's a quiet evening in Athens, sometime around 416 BCE. A few of the brightest minds in the city, Socrates, Aristophanes, Agathon, and others, are gathered at the home of Agathon, a newly successful tragedian who just won first prize at the dramatic festival. He's glowing with pride. The couches are lined with soft cushions, and the wine has already started to flow. This wasn't your typical drunk fest, though. The guests, a little hungover from the night before, had agreed to take it easy, to sip rather than guzzle. They decided to do something more cultured, take turns giving speeches in praise of love. Each man, in turn, stands to offer his interpretation. There are flowery words, philosophical digressions, witty jabs, and then Socrates, because of course, delivers a layered, mind-bending argument that flips the entire conversation inside out. It's a cozy night of minds at work, a quiet celebration of eros, virtue, and the soul's longing for beauty. And then the door crashes open, and in stumbles Alcibiades, absolutely plastered, flushed, uninvited, and wearing nothing but a wreath of ivy and a huge grin. According to Plato's account, Alcibiades is carried in by a rowdy entourage of flute girls and hangers-on, clearly having just left another, much louder celebration. He's staggering, boisterous, and in no condition to wax lyrical about abstract notions of love. But he demands to join the party anyway, because of course he does. And this isn't a small moment. Plato devotes the final, unforgettable portion of the symposium to Alcibiades' entrance. While everyone else had tried to philosophize about love, Alcibiades doesn't bother. Instead, he gives a drunken speech, not about love in general, but about Socrates. And it's wild. Slurring a bit, Alcibiades launches into what is essentially a mix between a roast, a confession, and a philosophical striptease. He calls Socrates ugly, compares him to a satyr, but also praises him as the only man he's ever truly admired. He accuses Socrates of being immune to seduction, immune to flattery, and terrifying in his intellectual consistency. Alcibiades, remember, had tried to seduce Socrates, tried hard, and failed miserably. And in front of this elite crowd, he lays it all bare. He recalls lying beside Socrates on cold stone floors, begging for his affection, offering every charm he had, and receiving nothing but long lectures and gentle refusals in return. It's awkward, it's hilarious, and it's painfully vulnerable. Imagine standing in a room of your peers, drunk off your sandals, confessing that the one person you couldn't manipulate was the only one who saw through you entirely. That's Alcibiades at that moment. It's both pathetic and brilliant. What makes this moment so extraordinary is how perfectly it captures the duality of Alcibiades, the seductive politician and the emotional wreck, the self-aggrandizing celebrity and the self-loathing philosopher's disciple. He's trying to reclaim the spotlight, but ends up exposing himself emotionally, not physically, though with Alcibiades it was usually a close call. And here's the thing, everyone lets it happen. No one kicks him out, no one scolds him. They laugh, they sigh, they top off his wine. Because Alcibiades is still Alcibiades, still charming, still beautiful, still a walking catastrophe of ego and insecurity. The room, for better or worse, is now his. Socrates listens, probably smiling that infuriatingly serene smile of his. The others, well, they lean back and sip their wine. This isn't just drama, it's theater, and it reveals something deeper about the symposium itself. This was never just about pleasure. Symposiums were stages, controlled chaos, social testing grounds, a place where ideas and desires and reputations were played with like so many dice thrown on a game board, and Alcibiades, even in full disarray, knew how to roll the dice in his favor. But this moment also marks a turning point. It's the last time we see Alcibiades in the glow of the philosophical lamp. After this, his life takes on a more tragic hue. His political gambles become riskier. His alliances shift. His enemies multiply. The charm that once opened every door begins to ring hollow. But for this brief, wine-soaked moment in Plato's symposium, Alcibiades is still the darling disaster of Athens, brilliant, broken, and absolutely unforgettable. And if you're wondering how things could possibly go more off the rails from here, don't worry, they do. But first, pour yourself another mental cup of wine and prepare for the next act, because the fall of Alcibiades is just beginning. Now, let's be fair. Athenian society had a pretty high tolerance for scandal. Drunken antics at a symposium, normal. Flirtation with courtesans, expected. Philosophical debates that veered wildly into blasphemy, practically a requirement. But there's a difference between entertaining the room and endangering it. And at some point, somewhere between Alcibiades' slippery charm and his political scheming, Athens began to shift in its seat, began to whisper behind its wine cup, began to realize that maybe, just maybe, the young lion wasn't playing a role anymore. He was playing with fire. Let's rewind to around 415 BCE. Athens was preparing for a massive military expedition to Sicily. It was an ambitious plan, some would say reckless. the kind of venture that needed both a charismatic leader and a sacrificial scapegoat. Alcibiades, unsurprisingly, volunteered to lead, because of course he did. He had the pedigree, he had the connections, and most importantly, he had the confidence, that radiant, irrational belief that whatever he touched would turn to gold. Athens voted to send him, alongside the more cautious Nicias, on what would become the ill-fated Sicilian expedition. But before the ships could sail, something strange happened. One morning the city awoke to find that dozens of Hermae, stone statues of Hermes placed around the city, had been mutilated, their faces defaced, their phallic parts, well, chipped away. It was shocking. These weren't just decorative markers, they were sacred, guardians of thresholds, protectors of households, and someone had dared to desecrate them on the eve of a major military campaign. Panic followed. Was it an omen, a political statement, a prank gone too far? And somehow Alcibiades' name floated to the top of the suspect list. Now, to be clear, there was no hard proof, just rumor, whispers. Maybe he'd joked too freely at the wrong party. Maybe someone remembered a crude toast or a drunken impersonation of a priest. Maybe his reputation, so dazzling, so slippery, finally turned on him. The result? A political mess. Alcibiades sailed with the fleet, yes, but the moment he left, charges were filed. A warrant was issued. And when the fleet reached Sicily, messengers arrived not with reinforcements but with orders. Alcibiades was to return to Athens immediately. He didn't. He ran. Straight into exile. Depending on which account you trust, he defected to Sparta, or Persia, or both. He may have even betrayed Athenian secrets to their enemies. It's messy, it's dramatic, it's exactly what you'd expect from someone whose life played out like a tragedy scribbled by Aristophanes and revised by Euripides. Back in Athens, the mood soured. The man who once charmed every dinner party had become a symbol of chaos, of excess, of everything that went wrong when charisma went unchecked. He was no longer just a reckless darling. He was a cautionary tale. And the symposium, it changed too. It became more reserved, less politically charged. Hosts grew cautious. Guests remembered that laughter could turn into interrogation, that a spilled secret could become a trial, that the man who once toasted to friendship might soon raise a cup to your enemies. It was, in many ways, the end of an era. Alcibiades did return, more than once depending on the decade, always with drama, always with flair. But each comeback was shorter, less triumphant. His final years were spent in political obscurity, bouncing between allies, fleeing new accusations. Eventually, he died in exile, reportedly assassinated while trying to win back yet another lost opportunity. It's a strange arc, from golden boy to ghost, from symposium centerpiece to whispered regret. And it begs the question, was it the wine, the power, the unchecked appetite for admiration? Or was Alcibiades simply a man born into the perfect storm, a society that loved beauty, loved wit, and couldn't quite figure out what to do when both were weaponized? Whatever the answer, the lesson lingers. There's a fine line between charisma and chaos, and sometimes it takes just one cup too many to cross it. By the time Alcibiades breathed his last, somewhere on the fringes of power, far from the walls of Athens, his legend had already begun to calcify, not in marble exactly, but in anecdotes, in cautionary tales told over flickering lamps, in the awkward silence that followed whenever his name was raised at a symposium, a silence that said, yes, we remember, we just wish we didn't. His death, like his life, was complicated, possibly orchestrated by Persian satraps, maybe encouraged by Spartan enemies, perhaps even nodded along by Athenian politicians who'd had enough of his inconvenient brilliance. According to one account, he was burned alive inside a home, cornered like a lion too dangerous to keep free. But even that ending feels too clean for someone like Alcibiades, who thrived in the blur of rumor and reputation. In the years that followed, Athenians had to figure out what to do with his memory. Do you celebrate the man who nearly brought down the city? Or do you bury him in stories, laugh him off as a charming wreck, a footnote of hubris with good cheekbones? The answer was both. For the philosophers, he was a paradox. Plato never quite condemned him. Even in the Symposium, where Alcibiades is at his most chaotic, there's an undertone of sympathy, as if Plato understood that Alcibiades was not just a man, but a reflection of Athens itself, beautiful, ambitious, unstable. For the playwrights, he was a gift. Satirical portrayals of Alcibiades circulated widely. Some depicted him as a drunken fool, others as a manipulative genius, still others as a tragic figure whose downfall was inevitable, no matter how many cups he raised in toast. And for the common citizen, he was gossip fodder turned legend. The kind of figure you mention when the wine starts flowing and someone dares to bring up politics. A reminder that charm, when poured too liberally, can curdle. And yet, even centuries later, he never quite disappears. Roman historians, Greek biographers, Enlightenment thinkers, they all came back to Alcibiades, drawn like so many moths to the flickering glow of a man who lived too brightly for too long. They didn't admire him exactly, but they couldn't look away either. There's something eerily modern about him, isn't there? That slippery dance between public and private life, the weaponization of charisma, the idea that you can be brilliant and self-destructive in the same breath, that fame is a kind of intoxication all its own, more potent than wine, and far more dangerous. If you've ever been to a dinner party where one person dominated the conversation, brilliant, magnetic, but also just a little too much, you've met a shadow of Alcibiades. And if you've ever watched that same person fall apart, stumble from grace, and try to claw their way back in with charm alone, you've seen the final toast of his legacy. But perhaps the most fitting tribute to Alcibiades isn't in a dusty biography or a sarcastic comedy. It's in the quiet, awkward pause that follows a drunken joke. The unspoken understanding among guests that yes, brilliance can be intoxicating, but sometimes it's also exhausting. The Symposium, after all, wasn't just a stage for ideas. It was a crucible of reputation, a balancing act between intellect, wit, charm, and moderation. And Alcibiades, for all his talents, never quite mastered that last part. He drank too deeply, from the crater and from life. And in the end, Athens drank him in return, remembered him, regretted him, revered him, but never, ever forgot him. Chapter 3. Wine, Gods, and Dionysian Madness. Let's take a moment. Lean back, literally. If you're lying in bed or on the couch, this part pairs nicely with a soft pillow and a slow exhale. Now, picture a goblet in your hand, cool ceramic, the faint, tangy aroma of watered wine. Somewhere nearby, a flute begins to play. Not a symphony, something breathy, meandering, a tune that sways more than marches. You are not at a party anymore. You are in the presence of a god, because in ancient Greece, drinking wasn't just a pastime. It wasn't merely social lubricant or a way to unwind after a long day of goat herding and awkward philosophical arguments. It was sacred, a ritual, a mild nightly brush with the divine. And at the heart of it all, wreathed in ivy and humming with chaos, was Dionysus. You've probably heard the name. Maybe you associate it with wine or drama or some vague sense of mischief. But in ancient Greece, Dionysus wasn't some tipsy side character. He was one of the Olympians, a full-fledged deity, and his portfolio included not just wine, but transformation, ecstasy, madness, revelation. He was, to put it mildly, not the kind of god you prayed to for a good harvest or a quiet life. You called on Dionysus when you wanted to break through the ordinary, and that's exactly what the symposium tried to do. Now, Dionysus wasn't always a mainstream god. In the earlier days, he was considered strange, foreign, even dangerous. His worshippers included women who ran screaming into the woods, possessed by something wild and ancient. His festivals included masked dances, flute music, and the occasional public indecency. And his rituals, let's just say the line between religious experience and drunken riot, was extremely porous. But over time, Dionysus was absorbed into the fabric of Greek life. Not tamed exactly, just accepted. And with that acceptance came one of the strangest, most enduring cultural ideas in the ancient world. Drinking could be a form of prayer. Now, let's be clear. The Greeks didn't think getting blackout drunk made you wise. In fact, moderation was key. Remember the crater? That big communal mixing bowl used to dilute wine with water? That wasn't a courtesy. It was a moral safeguard. Unmixed wine, called akratos, was considered dangerous. Only gods and barbarians drank it straight. Civilized men knew better. They mixed, they measured, they watched each other's cups. But within that moderation, there was space. Space to loosen the tongue, to uncoil the tight springs of the day, to open the mind to thoughts that wouldn't arrive sober. That's what Dionysus offered. Not chaos, but controlled dissolution, a guided descent into revelation. And the symposium, believe it or not, was part of that descent. Each part of the evening mirrored ritual. The libations to start, small sips poured out in honor of the gods. The songs and hymns that followed, often performed with eerie devotion. The way the wine was passed, the conversation spiraled, the laughter surged. It wasn't just entertainment, it was worship in disguise. Dionysus was there in the flicker of the oil lamps, in the flush on your cheeks, in the moments when someone said something too honest, too raw, and the room went quiet. He was there in the tension between restraint and abandon, and sometimes he stepped out of the shadows. There are stories, scattered like grape seeds across the ancient texts, of symposia that turned strange, where laughter became weeping, where music seemed to shimmer, where someone spoke in verse without knowing why. Dionysus wasn't a god you summoned, he was a god you risked inviting. And when he came, nothing stayed the same. For the Greeks, this made sense. Life was hard, rationality was revered, but also exhausting. The symposium, for all its elegance and structure, offered a window, a way to temporarily step outside of the rigid order of the city. A sanctioned moment of emotional exposure, a kind of theatrical madness. And at the center of it all, a god with ivy in his hair and wine on his breath. Dionysus wasn't about losing control. He was about finding something on the other side of it. Something strange, something sacred, something perhaps you'd been trying to forget. So as you sit there, half asleep, picturing that crater and the flickering lamp beside it, just remember, the next time someone tells you that ancient Greek parties were just toga and toast affairs, remind them that every cup carried a whisper of divinity, every toast, a hymn, every slightly too personal comment, a prayer. Because Dionysus was always watching, and sometimes he answered. If the symposium was a quiet stage, oil lamps flickering, conversation buzzing softly like bees in a warm room, then the Komos was its loud, barefoot cousin crashing in from the street. No invitations, no moderation, no measured mixing of wine in communal bowls. The Komos didn't wait for decorum. It erupted. Now, imagine it's sometime after midnight in a well-to-do Greek city, maybe Athens, maybe Thebes. You've just settled into bed, the clay walls are cool, the night air drifting through the shuttered windows. Then in the distance, you hear it, a flute, then another, then a rhythmic chant, not quite music, not quite shouting, it's getting closer and louder. There's laughter, feet stomping on the packed earth, a low, throaty roar of men, intoxicated and blissful, charging through the alleys like gods of mischief. Welcome to the Komos. The Komos wasn't exactly a parade, though it might look like one to a confused modern tourist, and it wasn't quite a riot, though it often came dangerously close. It was a ritualized drunken procession, an extension of the symposium into the public sphere. Think of it like the after-party no one could escape, especially not the neighbors. Participants would leave the symposium, already buzzing with Dionysian fervor, and spill into the streets in a pack. Some carried torches, others carried musical instruments or jugs of leftover wine. Most wore garlands of ivy or laurel, flowers drooping in the heat of their sweat. A few wore masks, crude and theatrical, emulating satyrs or playing characters of their own invention. Some were barely dressed, others fully nude. There were no rules, not really, just a vague understanding that this was allowed because it was sacred or something. What did they do? Well, they sang, they shouted, they recited poetry. Some of it sublime, some of it invented on the spot, slurred and ridiculous. They made offerings at shrines. They toasted Dionysus loudly into the darkness, and yes, they occasionally knocked on doors, heckled passers-by, or harassed respectable citizens who didn't want to play along. Was it annoying? Absolutely. Was it tolerated? Usually, yes, because the Komos, in its loud ridiculousness, was considered a socially sanctioned venting of chaos, a pressure valve for a tightly ordered society. You had your law courts, your assemblies, your measured debates, but you also had to let off steam, and the Komos, for all its absurdity, was a sacred safety release, and it wasn't just about fun. There was, strangely, a competitive edge to these processions. Young aristocrats often used them to show off, not just their ability to drink or shout the loudest, but to perform, to demonstrate charisma, wit, courage. A good Komos performance could elevate your social standing, much like a well-executed toast in the symposium. The boundaries between entertainment and politics blurred under the moonlight. Some komoi, yes, that's the plural, had themes. Some centered around particular festivals, like the Anthesteria, a springtime wine celebration where spirits of the dead were believed to roam the earth. During that festival, a komos wasn't just a drunken romp, it was a spiritual escort guiding lost souls back to their realm, which explains a bit the masks and the torches and the fact that nobody really knew whether the man howling in your alley was just tipsy or touched by something older and darker. And speaking of old, the Komos was ancient even to the ancient Greeks. Its roots likely stretch back to pre-Homeric fertility rites, when early agricultural societies held seasonal festivals filled with wine, song, and ecstatic dance to ensure a good harvest. Over centuries, those practices evolved into something more theatrical, but no less charged. But if you're imagining a kind of Greco-Roman Mardi Gras, you're not entirely wrong. The key difference? The religious undertone. The idea that this wasn't just noise for noise's sake, it was communion with the irrational, a celebration of the part of humanity that doesn't fit neatly into law codes or philosophical dialogues. Dionysus, again, was at the heart of it, but not as a tidy statue in a temple. No, Dionysus in the Komos was wild, drunk, laughing, wearing a mask that might smile or might leer. He was in the sway of the flute melody, the flicker of the torchlight, the moment when a chant turns into a scream and then back into laughter, and to the sober citizens watching from their windows, he was probably terrifying, which, of course, was the point. To participate in a komos was to surrender, to let go of decorum, to risk being absurd, and for the ancient Greeks who lived in a world obsessed with order, balance, and reputation that was both frightening and necessary, a reminder that even the best citizen carried a little chaos inside, that ecstasy and madness were never more than a few cups away. So the next time you hear someone brag about how those ancient Greeks really knew how to party, you might want to pause. Yes, they did. But it wasn't just a party. It was theater, it was ritual, and at its core, it was a night-long negotiation with the edge of sanity. Would you have joined the komos? Maybe. But you'd probably want to leave your dignity at home, and your neighbors might not speak to you for a week. Now, you might be tempted to dismiss all of this, the symposiums, the komoi, the ivy-crowned frenzy, as exaggeration. After all, ancient texts love a bit of poetic flair. Maybe Plato and Euripides were just indulging in metaphor. Maybe the truth was tamer. Maybe the average Greek drinking party looked more like a quiet dinner with friends and less like a sacred frat party with ritual chanting. But then there are the vases. The ancient Greeks, bless them, painted everything. And they painted it with a kind of honesty that is, frankly, startling. If you've ever wandered through the dusty corridors of an archaeological museum, especially one with a Greek collection, you've likely seen them. Black figure, red figure, amphorae, kylixes, craters, ceramics so beautiful and balanced you almost don't realize what you're looking at until you look closely. Because what those painted surfaces show us isn't mythic battles or heroic quests, at least not always. More often they show party scenes, drinking games, dancers, flute girls, men reclining, wine cups in hand, eyes drooping, sometimes laughing, sometimes vomiting, sometimes doing things we won't get into here. But let's just say the ancient Greeks weren't shy. The vases are our unfiltered backstage pass to the ancient party, and they tell a story far more vivid than most textbooks ever dare to recount. Let's start with the kylix, a shallow, wide-mouthed drinking cup, often with two elegant handles. Kylix were made not just to hold wine, but to interact with the drinker. Tilt the cup back far enough, and the image at the bottom reveals itself. Sometimes it's a dancing satyr, sometimes it's an eye staring back, sometimes it's a face grinning from the depths of the wine. You'd sip, and then, surprise, a painted companion at the bottom of your cup. And this wasn't just decorative, it was playful psychological design. The cup became part of the experience, a silent guest at the symposium. Other vessels, like amphorae and craters, often depicted more elaborate scenes. There's one famous red figure vase that shows a man trying and failing to stand up straight while another gently supports him. Behind them, a woman plays a flute. Around them, grapevines curl. The implication, the wine has won. There are scenes of kotobos, a popular drinking game where you'd fling the dregs of your wine at a target, sort of like ring toss, but stickier. Men are shown in mid-fling, concentrating as though this were an Olympic event, which in a way it was. There were rules, prizes, prestige, and then there are the symposia scenes that verge into myth, where Dionysus appears among the guests, where satyrs cavort, where the line between real and imagined dissolves into vine leaves and stylized grins. These weren't just illustrations, they were reflections of a cultural idea that drinking was a liminal space, a threshold between the mundane and the divine. It's worth noting that these vases weren't hidden away, they were used, handled, passed around, brought to actual symposiums, which means that the imagery wasn't ornamental, it was participatory. As the wine flowed, as the jokes turned bawdy, as the flute music swirled through the room, someone might hold up a kylix and say, "Look at this guy, he can't even sit up." Laughter, recognition, camaraderie, and so the painted figures became mirrors, stories, warnings maybe, or just reminders that no matter how philosophical the conversation, someone, somewhere, had probably already spilled their wine. Even more fascinating is how archaeologists use these vases today. When they excavate an ancient site, especially the remains of a symposium space, they often find broken pottery shards, discarded cup handles, or entire vessels tossed into pits. These fragments, painstakingly reassembled, become some of the clearest windows we have into Greek drinking culture. And they're everywhere, from Etruscan tombs to Athenian trash heaps. The remains of ancient drinking parties litter the Mediterranean, and the images they carry of joy, absurdity, flirtation, and excess feel oddly familiar. A little too familiar, maybe. Because here's the thing. Across the centuries, across cultures, humans have used alcohol not just to unwind, but to reveal, to expose something just beneath the surface. And the Greeks, ever the lovers of spectacle and duality, knew this better than most. That's what the vases tell us, not just that they drank or danced or flirted, but that they knew what they were doing, that they ritualized it, celebrated it, and then captured it in clay to be passed down to us like a tipsy time capsule. So the next time you're sipping something, anything, picture that kylix, picture the grin at the bottom, and know that somewhere, 2,500 years ago, someone else was doing the same thing, and probably losing at Korobos. So far, we've talked about the symposium, the curated drinking space. We've paraded through the komos, the sacred mess in the streets. We've studied the vases, where truth was inked in black and red for all to see. But to fully understand what made these drinking parties so powerful, so memorable, so unhandleable to the modern soul, you have to look beyond the wine. The Greeks weren't just drinking to get drunk. That was barbaric, in their opinion, something the uncultured tribes to the north might do. Real Greek men mixed their wine, moderated their pace, reclined on fine couches, and bathed their evenings in something richer than alcohol. They bathed them in sensation. Let's start with the music. The ancient Greek symposium was soundtracked not by silence or idle chatter, but by the delicate, high-pitched melodies of the aulos, a double-reeded instrument not unlike two oboes played at once. The sound was nasal, sharp, and utterly transporting. Imagine a piercing tune winding its way around conversation, threading itself into the rhythm of your thoughts, making the flicker of the oil lamps feel a little more magical than it should. And it wasn't just music, it was often dance. Hired dancers, sometimes women, sometimes boys, would spin and leap between guests adorned in veils or garlands. They'd perform slow, hypnotic movements or wild, ecstatic spins, depending on the mood the host had curated. This wasn't a show from afar. It was close, intimate, woven into the very air of the evening. Now add incense, burnt over charcoal in small bronze braziers. The smoke would curl through the room. Frankincense, myrrh, exotic blends from the east that mingled with the scent of wine, sweat, and perfumed oils. This olfactory haze created a kind of sensory soup that blurred the hard edges of the room, softened the feel of your own body, and made your fellow guests shimmer just slightly more than they should. And let's not forget the lighting. They didn't have chandeliers or neon signs. They had oil lamps, terracotta vessels filled with olive oil, lit with short wicks that gave off a flickering golden light. This glow danced across painted walls, caught in the glint of bronze and made everything feel just a bit removed from reality. The edges of the symposium room weren't dark, they were mysterious, deep, like maybe Dionysius himself was just out of sight. All of this, the music, the scent, the movement, the light, was designed not just to entertain but to transform. The symposium was meant to shift your state of mind, to take you from the rational Apollonian world of daytime Athens and gently, or sometimes not so gently, guide you into something Dionysian, something liminal, somewhere between clarity and chaos, logic and emotion, identity and performance. And here's where things get especially interesting: the aphrodisiacs. Yes, the ancient Greeks had them. Herbs like saffron, cinnamon, anise, and even mandrake were sometimes infused into wine or burned as incense to arouse the senses or open the soul. Certain wines were thought to be more stimulating than others. Certain scents made you more talkative, more receptive, more, well, let's say sociable. This wasn't science, but it was belief. And belief has power, especially when shared across a candlelit room with soft music and strong drink. So imagine this. You're lying back on a couch, sipping from a kylix. A flute girl plays nearby, eyes half-lidded. The air smells of warmed resin and bruised herbs. The lamplight blurs the features of the person across from you. They quote something clever from Sappho or Anacreon. You laugh, too hard. The room spins, not from drink, but from presence, from immersion. You feel your role in society slipping just a little. You are no longer the merchant or the senator or the philosopher's student. You are just someone floating through sensation. And that was the point. The symposium was carefully curated to dismantle the self, not entirely, just enough. Enough to invite play, vulnerability, connection. It was a temporary untying of the tight knots of identity. A moment when men, taught to be composed, rational, orderly, could indulge the irrational, the erotic, the humorous, the sacred, and when the evening ended, if it ended, you returned home, to your wife, your children, your politics, and you carried with you the memory of the music, the scent, the poetry, the laughter. You were changed, not permanently, but meaningfully, which is why even now, 2,000 years later, we keep trying to recreate it. Candlelight dinners, jazz bars, speakeasies, even the low hum of a late-night Zoom call over wine with friends. We're always chasing that feeling of shared unreality, of performance, of permission. But let's be honest, you wouldn't last long in a real Greek symposium, not because the wine was strong, but because the world it created was. We've wandered through the haze of incense, flirted with the flute girl, lost a game of katabos, and stared into the painted eyes at the bottom of a wine cup. But now, as the music winds down and the last lamps sputter, it's time to ask something deeper. Why did the ancient Greeks pour so much energy, ritual and meaning into drinking parties? Why make such a fuss about wine, conversation and poetic toasts? The answer, oddly enough, isn't about the wine at all. It's about control and its release. You see, ancient Greek society was tightly ordered. There were strict hierarchies, rigid gender roles, social expectations down to the way you walked, greeted someone, or arranged your cloak. Public behavior was scrutinized. One misstep could ruin a reputation. Your name, your family, your honor, all of it hung delicately in balance. So what do you do in a society like that? One that prides itself on balance, self-restraint, and moderation, but still pulses with deeply human desires. Desires for pleasure, for chaos, for rebellion. You carve out a space for it. The symposium was that space, a pressure valve for the soul. It allowed elite Greek men, and let's be honest, it was largely men, to engage in behaviors that would be inappropriate, even scandalous, during the day. You could flirt, you could cry, you could laugh at crude jokes or deliver rousing speeches about love. You could quote Sappho or seduce with Euripides. You could argue about politics without a toga on. You could drink too much and blame it on Dionysus. This wasn't chaos, it was structured transgression, a managed madness. Every element of the symposium, the order of the toasts, the moderation of the wine, the role of the symposiarch, the use of incense and music, was designed to create a liminal space, a place where reality bent but didn't break, where identity softened but didn't dissolve, where the tensions of the polis could be laughed about, dissected, or just drunkenly ignored. And that's crucial, because for all the grandeur of Athenian democracy, it was a society under constant stress. Wars, plagues, social unrest, the ever-present anxiety of maintaining balance between freedom and order, chaos and control. The symposium, then, became a place to process that tension, through poetry, through play, through ritual drunkenness. It's also worth remembering that these parties weren't isolated. They were part of a seasonal and civic rhythm. The city Dionysia, for example, was a massive Athenian festival that included dramatic performances, feasting, and of course, wine. It was a public version of the private symposium, reinforcing the same values: laughter, catharsis, transgression, and return, because that's the key difference between Dionysian madness and actual disorder. You came back. You put your sandals on. You stepped into the light of morning. You resumed your role as citizen, husband, general, farmer. The revelry ended. The flute girl left. The room was swept, and Athens marched forward, wine-stained but intact. Now contrast that with modern life. Today, we have no symposium, no structured space for emotional honesty through ritualized excess. We have happy hours, concerts, basement parties, but rarely the sense of communal transformation that the Greeks achieved. Their parties weren't just about pleasure. They were about meaning, about facing the irrational within a rational world, about exploring vulnerability in a culture obsessed with control. And so, when you think about why you couldn't handle an ancient Greek drinking party, don't just blame the strong wine or the dizzying poetry contests. Blame the emotional exposure. Blame the demand for wit, sensuality, and performance, all wrapped into a single evening. Blame the absence of digital escape, of cell phones, of anonymity, because at a symposium you were seen. Every gesture, every quote, every sip of wine, it was all part of a delicate, theatrical dance. You were playing a role, but not to hide, to reveal, just a little, just enough. And that's why the symposium mattered, not because it was fun, though it certainly was, but because it allowed the Greeks to be more fully themselves by stepping briefly outside themselves, to honor Dionysus not just as a god of drink, but as a god of disruption, of contradiction, of truth beneath the mask. And that perhaps is the part we moderns wouldn't survive. Not the hangover, but the mirror. Chapter 4. Meanwhile, at the house of a wealthy host. You've survived the philosophical debates, the drunken poetry games, the smoke, the sweat, and the haunting gaze of Dionysus. But before we wrap things up, it's time to step somewhere quieter, or at least more curated. Let's visit the home of an elite Athenian host, one of the wealthiest men in the city. The kind of man who doesn't just throw a party, he orchestrates an experience, Because in Athens, being rich wasn't just about having money, it was about displaying it artfully, and nowhere was that art more visible than in the architecture, decor, and precise hospitality of the symposium space, especially in the Andron, the men's drinking room tucked strategically within the private quarters of the home. The Andron was a status symbol. It was deliberately designed for impressing guests and performing refinement. You didn't just build a house and tack on a drinking room. You planned it, furnished it, and scented it like a luxury item. Let's open the door. Inside, the floors are mosaic, hand-laid tiny stone tiles forming mythological scenes underfoot. Maybe Heracles wrestles a lion. Maybe Dionysius drifts by on a ship with vines growing from the mast. These floors weren't just decoration. They were conversation starters, reminders of myth, or subtle nods to your political leanings and personal tastes. Along the walls you'll find painted plaster, rich ochres, deep greens, earthy reds, framing geometric patterns, garlands, or stylized dolphins. The colors were bold but tasteful, expensive without being gaudy. Everything whispered, "I have taste, I have means, I know the rules of the game." Now look around the room. The couches, called clenae, are arranged in a tight horseshoe or square, each one covered in fine wool or linen throws. The woodwork is carved, sometimes inlaid with ivory or bronze. Each guest has a spot, not assigned with little cards like at a wedding, but socially understood, a silent choreography of prestige. The lowest status guest is near the door. That's you, by the way. The closer you are to the symposiarch, the master of ceremonies, the higher your social rank. This hierarchy wasn't casual. It shaped everything from how much wine you got to how closely people listened when you spoke. Let's talk about the symposiarch for a second. He's not a DJ. He's not a caterer. He's more like a cross between a ringmaster and a philosopher king. He decides how strong the wine will be, what games will be played, how long the evening should last. His role is critical. A bad symposiarch lets the party devolve into chaos. A good one walks the tightrope between wildness and control. You might think he's always the host, but not necessarily. Sometimes the host would defer the title to an honored guest. It was a sign of trust, or maybe political flattery, or maybe both. At your side, a flute girl plays softly. She's not just entertainment, she's rhythm. She punctuates conversation. She signals transitions. She fills in the spaces between awkward pauses or heavy debates. Her music might fade into the background, but it shapes the entire mood. The room smells faintly of rosemary and smoke. There are braziers tucked into corners, giving off heat and subtle perfumes. The wine is warm, served in metal or ceramic kylixes, passed carefully so as not to spill. And before the first sip, an offering, a small libation poured onto the floor, accompanied by a quiet prayer to the gods. Because yes, even here, in this carefully engineered setting, the divine is invited. Dionysus is always watching. You're not just drinking with men, you're drinking with myth. Now imagine the energy of the room. Not boisterous, not quiet either. There's a hum, like the murmur of a well-fed hive. Voices rise and fall. Laughter flickers through the air. Someone recites a poem they definitely practiced in advance. Another offers a toast, quoting Homer with just enough flourish to impress, but not enough to seem desperate. You're seated, watching, listening, trying to play your part. Say too little, and you're forgettable. Say too much, and you're mocked. It's like a play where no one gave you a script, and all the while the host watches, not sternly, not even directly, but he notices every slip, every compliment, every whispered aside, because this party isn't just for fun, it's a stage for alliances, for gossip, for soft power. This is what makes the elite symposium so different from the drunken revels of the street. It's not about freedom, it's about performance under pressure. You're being tested, measured, remembered, and if you do well, you might get invited again. You might be seated one couch closer to the symposiarch next time. You might climb, or you might say the wrong thing, drink too much, lose your cool in a round of poetry and fall into someone's lap, in which case you'll be the subject of tomorrow's gossip, a cautionary tale whispered between amphorae, and you'll have no one to blame but yourself, because in the house of a wealthy host, the wine is only part of the experience. The real drink is status. Let's say the wine has been poured, the couches are full, and the flute girl is already easing into her second song of the evening. There's incense in the air and soft laughter bubbling somewhere near the center of the room. But before the party really begins, before toasts are made and philosophy spirals into gentle drunken chaos, someone has to decide how the entire evening will unfold. Enter the symposiarch. Now let's be clear. The symposiarch wasn't elected with ballots or speeches. He wasn't necessarily the host, though he could be. He was more like a designated adult with a wine cup, a man granted temporary authority over the entire room. His decisions were absolute. His word was final. In the realm of the symposium, he was king of the crater. His primary role? Moderation and control, and knowing just how far he could let the leash slip before things unraveled entirely. Let's unpack that. First, the mixing of the wine. Ancient Greeks didn't drink their wine straight. That was considered barbaric, something uncultured tribes might do out in the wilderness where manners and moderation didn't exist. Instead, wine was mixed with water in a crater, a large communal bowl, and the symposiarch decided the ratio. A 3-to-1 water-to-wine mix was common, a little stronger if the guests were close friends, a little weaker if politics were on the agenda. If he really wanted to keep things tame, he might go 5-to-1 or higher, and if he wanted to let the night drift toward divine madness, he'd mix it closer to 2-to-1, or worse, equal parts, for the brave and the foolish. This ratio wasn't just about intoxication, it was about pace, about shaping conversation, about controlling the mood. Wine too strong, and the philosophical discussion turns into slurred monologues and accidental foot stomping. Too weak, and nobody relaxes enough to speak freely. The symposiarch had to read the room like a seasoned conductor, but wine was only the beginning. The symposiarch also set the structure of the evening, when to toast, when to play a game, when to call for a round of poetry or a song, when to introduce a riddle or a topic for debate. Think of him as a kind of philosopher-host, hype man hybrid. With sandals, he might announce, "Let each man now speak in praise of Eros, the god of love," and suddenly the evening becomes a delicate performance of admiration, seduction, and metaphor. Or he might challenge the group to compose impromptu verses on the nature of virtue, while half a cup deep into a very bold vintage. Was it fair? Rarely. Did it matter? Not at all. Being symposiarch came with enormous social pressure. If he was too strict, he was a bore. If he was too lenient, the party collapsed into chaos. The trick was to hover somewhere in the middle, offering just enough structure to keep things flowing, but not so much that people felt boxed in. And yet, his power wasn't absolute. Not really. It was deeply performative. He had to embody the very balance the symposium claimed to uphold. He had to drink, but not too much. Speak, but not dominate. Laugh, but never snort. Guide, but never scold. He was the invisible thread holding the night together, without ever seeming like he was trying too hard. Imagine that pressure. Now imagine doing it while slightly tipsy, under the gaze of your social equals and rivals, with every misstep likely to be repeated, loudly, the next morning at the agora. Oh, and did we mention? Sometimes the symposiarch was chosen by lot. Yes, randomly, which means you, the underdressed guest sitting near the door, might suddenly be handed a garland and told, "Congratulations, you're in charge." And now it's your job to keep the peace, entertain the crowd, and manage the mood, while calculating exactly how diluted the next crater should be so that Stelios doesn't try to wrestle someone again. No pressure. Of course, some men loved the role, thrived in it. They were natural ringmasters, born to juggle egos, quotations, and wine ratios. But others, they crumbled, they hesitated, they fumbled the order of toasts or allowed the crater to run dry. And in a society where reputation was everything, that kind of failure could cling like the smell of old resin. So why even risk it? Because being symposiarch, done well, earned respect. It proved you had poise, taste, social intelligence. You could navigate tension, lead conversation, and keep things entertaining without descending into vulgarity. You weren't just the life of the party, you were its soul. And afterward, as the last guest stumbled home and the flute girl packed up her instrument, your name would linger in the minds of those who mattered. You'd be mentioned the next day, not as the drunk who spilled the wine, but as the one who held the night together with style. So the next time someone romanticizes ancient drinking parties, remember this: someone had to run them, and it wasn't a job for the faint of heart, or the weak of stomach, or the socially awkward. It was a performance of quiet dominance in a room full of egos and alcohol, and you'd probably have spilled the wine on your own sandal by now. Let's shift the focus now. The room is full, the wine has been chosen, and the symposiarch has called for a topic. You're seated awkwardly, trying not to spill from your cup or mispronounce any names. But here's where things get even more intimidating. The social pressure to be charming, because unlike a modern house party, where you might find refuge by scrolling on your phone, hiding in the kitchen, or nodding along to a playlist, at a Greek symposium there was no background noise to disappear into. Conversation was the entertainment, and it was expected to be sharp, clever, and, let's be honest, a bit performative. You weren't just drinking, you were competing. Enter the hetairai, professional courtesans, entertainers, and conversation artists. These women weren't like typical wives, who were expected to remain indoors and silent during male gatherings. Hetairai were trained in rhetoric, music, and social manipulation. They played the lyre, sang, laughed at just the right moments, and could debate philosophy as fluently as they could recite Sappho. They were more than company. They were equal participants in the social performance, sometimes more skillful than the men themselves. And yes, they were beautiful, but their value came from their intellectual and social agility. They could tilt a conversation in your favor, ease an insult with a perfectly timed joke, or plant a double entendre that hung in the air like incense. If you were lucky enough or rich enough to be seated near one, your night might go a bit smoother, or not, because even with help, this was still a verbal gladiator arena, and there were no cheat codes for charm. Let's talk topics. Typical conversation starters at a symposium might include: what is the nature of love? Is courage taught or innate? Which is better, wealth or wisdom? Who's the most virtuous man in Athens? Not exactly small talk, and not easy to fake your way through if you were more interested in the wine than in quoting Hesiod. But it wasn't all abstract debate. There were also drinking games, the most famous, kotobos. You'd flick the dregs of your wine at a target, maybe a saucer balanced on a stand, while shouting out the name of your secret crush. Yes, even in ancient Athens, people were flinging liquids across the room in the name of romance and reputation. Now imagine doing this with a room full of judgmental men, elite peers, and at least one courtesan who's watched better men than you miss the target completely. Pressure? Just a little. And all of this unfolded under constant observation, not just of your physical behavior, but of your tone, your word choice, your metaphors. Were you clever without being smug? Insightful without being pedantic? Did you use just the right mythological reference to impress without sounding rehearsed? If not, you were dismissed, politely with a chuckle, or silently with a raised eyebrow. Either way, you didn't win the round, because that's what the symposium was, in the end, a series of unspoken rounds, verbal duels, rhetorical chess games, flirtation as a blood sport. You weren't trying to seduce everyone. You were trying to be memorable. Even the music, soft and hypnotic, couldn't save you if you fumbled a punchline or misattributed a line from Homer to Herodotus. That kind of mistake lived on in gossip. It might even end up as the subject of a biting poem composed later that night by someone slightly tipsy and deeply petty. There was no escape. And yes, some participants thrived in this setting. They were natural raconteurs, men who could spin a myth into a joke and back again, who could flatter and challenge in the same sentence. But for most people, this wasn't just a party, it was a performance review with wine. So as you sit there, half listening, half panicking, you try to contribute something. Maybe you recite a proverb, maybe you ask a question, maybe you quote a line you barely remember from school. And for one shining moment, someone nods. The flute pauses. The courtesan beside you smiles. You breathe. You survived a round. Only 3 hours to go. By now, you may be feeling a little more confident, or at least a little more buzzed. You've managed to avoid major social faux pas, contributed a passable comment on virtue, and even hit the kotobos target on your second try. Not bad. But just as you begin to relax into the rhythm of the evening, someone taps their cup with deliberate ceremony. The conversation softens. The flute player lowers her gaze. A guest clears his throat, raises his kylix, and says a few solemn words, not to the crowd, but to the gods. Because, make no mistake, this wasn't just drinking, this was ritual. At an ancient Greek symposium, the divine was always present, hovering just beneath the surface of the laughter and flirtation. Every proper symposium began with a libation, a small portion of wine poured out onto the ground or into a special bowl in honor of the gods. The host or symposiarch might invoke Dionysius, god of wine and ecstasy, or Zeus, protector of guests and oaths. Sometimes a libation was offered to the agathos daimon, the good spirit of the household, or to departed ancestors. The gods received their sip before any mortal did. It was a reminder, this pleasure, this gathering, this excess. It was all granted, permitted, blessed, but also watched, monitored. The libation marked the beginning of the transformation. With that sacred sip, the symposium crossed from mere dinner into something else, a space of blurred boundaries between sacred and profane, between individual and group, between self and spirit. And these rituals didn't stop with the opening pour. Throughout the night, guests might toast to the gods during transitions, between rounds of wine, or after a particularly clever insight. When the crater was refilled, a second libation might be offered. When a guest prepared to leave early, they might say a quiet prayer and offer a final drop from their cup. Even in the middle of boisterous games or heated arguments, someone might pause to lift a cup in silence. To the modern eye, these gestures might seem small, decorative, but to the ancient Greek mind, they were essential threads in the social and spiritual fabric. Drinking without libation was not just rude, it was dangerous. It was an invitation for things to go wrong, for order to unravel. And this wasn't just superstition, it was culture. Ancient Greeks believed in the constant presence of the gods, not as distant beings but as neighbors, invisible attendees at every gathering, unseen judges at every toast. So when the party grew too loud, when laughter turned bawdy or tempers flared, there was always that lingering sense. Someone divine might be listening, someone who could tip the scales. Of course, Dionysus himself was a paradox, a god of joy and release, yes, but also of madness and frenzy. He could bring divine inspiration or drunken collapse. His presence at a symposium was both invited and feared. Too little wine and he might feel snubbed. Too much and he might take over. In that delicate balance, the rituals mattered. They weren't just spiritual obligations. They were safety rails, guardrails for an evening teetering between civilization and chaos. Take the three-crater rule, a poetic standard mentioned in some sources. The first crater was for health, the second for love and pleasure, the third for sleep. After that, things got dangerous. The fourth brought shouting, the fifth dancing, the sixth brawls, the seventh broken furniture, the eighth police, the ninth vomiting, the 10th forgetfulness. It was meant as a joke, sure, but also a moral reminder. Moderation wasn't just good etiquette, it was the thin line between celebrating with the gods and inviting their wrath. So as the night winds on, you watch another libation splash quietly to the floor. The scent of wine and frankincense mingles in the air. The shadows flicker against painted walls, and you begin to realize this isn't just a party. It's a ritualized passage, a shared transformation, from sober to tipsy, from individual to collective, from mundane to mythical. You begin to see why they called Dionysus not just the god of wine, but the god of theater, of masks and roles, of truth disguised in jest. Because here, tonight, in this room, everyone is playing a part, and the libations remind them someone is watching from just behind the curtain. The last of the wine has been drained. The crater stands empty now, streaked with purple residue. The flute girl has long since stopped playing. A few guests doze where they sit, heads slumped to one side, wreaths askew, sandal straps loosened. Others are still murmuring, laughing too loudly at things that probably weren't funny. And a few, more disciplined, more calculating, have slipped away early, leaving only the scent of perfume and a lingering impression of cleverness. But the party isn't over, because the real consequences of a symposium often began after the last toast. In modern terms, you might call it networking, or PR, or soft diplomacy. But to an ancient Athenian, a symposium was as much a political instrument as it was a social indulgence. Every smile exchanged, every story shared, every argument made with just the right mixture of passion and control, those moments mattered. They echoed beyond the couches into courtrooms, marketplaces, and council chambers. You might think, after all that wine and banter, that little would be remembered. But that's where you'd be wrong. The Greeks prized memory. Oral culture was everything, and those who could recall not just events, but exact phrasing, who said what and how, were prized as storytellers, gossip carriers, and social amplifiers. A cutting insult delivered with poetic flair might become the talk of the agora the next morning. A well-reasoned political stance floated gently over the third crater could end up shaping real policy in the assembly. The symposium was not a vacuum. It was a microcosm of the city's soul. And yes, there were hangovers, physically, sure. Your head aches. Your tunic smells like resin and smoke. Your mouth tastes like regret. But there were also social hangovers, the kind that lingered in the form of reputational bruises. Did you offend someone important? Laugh too loudly at a rival's joke? Spill wine on the host's prized couch covering? These little details became the ingredients of Athenian social math, subtle calculations of honor, favor, and future alliances. The symposium was where young men were noticed, not just for wealth or lineage, but for poise, cleverness, and restraint. A slip of the tongue could cost you political credibility. A witty toast might earn you a patron. And if you were ambitious, like a certain Alcibiades we'll meet again soon, then every symposium was an opportunity to build a persona, to be seen, heard, remembered, and sometimes to manipulate. But what about those who weren't born into elite circles? What about the hired entertainers, the flute girls, the servants refilling craters, cleaning up after broken kylixes, blotting spills before they stained the frescoed walls? For them, the morning after wasn't philosophical reflection or social strategy. It was a return to labor, to sweeping the floors, airing the couches, hauling the laundry. Their participation was invisible the next day, their presence absorbed into the fog of noble memory. Yet they too observed, listened, passed on what they heard, maybe to other servants, maybe to employers, maybe to friends in the agora. Gossip in Athens had many mouths, and the symposium, for all its exclusivity, was never truly secret. There's something haunting about that even in this dim, scented room, half spiritual, half carnal, painted with vines and warmed with laughter, you were never really safe. Every word might echo, every silence might speak volumes, every spilled libation might mark the start of a story you can't control. So as dawn creeps in through the lattice shutters, and the city begins to stir with early vendors, scribes, and street dogs, the last guests stagger home, their footsteps uneven, their tunics stained, their minds replaying conversations and calculations. Some will nurse their wine heads in private, others will head straight to the gymnasium pretending they're not still dizzy. A few, ever composed, will walk with perfect posture as if they didn't just confess something foolish while chasing a courtesan's laugh. And you'll sit quietly on the edge of your borrowed couch, wreath crumpled in your lap, wondering whether you impressed or embarrassed yourself, whether anyone noticed your slip, your silence, your brief moment of wit. You'll try to remember the names, the faces, the gods to whom you offered your first sip. But the truth is, you'll never really know what your night meant to everyone else. You'll only know what it cost you, in composure, in clarity, in caution. Because for all its elegance, its ritual, its philosophical grandeur, the symposium was a game, one with winners, losers, and 100 shades in between. A place where wine met politics, where laughter masked ambition, and where the gods looked on, amused. And now it's over. So here we are. The couches are empty. The wine has run dry, and the soft flicker of oil lamps has given way to the gentle grey of morning. The symposium, in all its ceremony and chaos, has ended, and you're left with the hum of memory, blurred, echoing, oddly tender. It's a strange thought, isn't it, that something as simple as drinking wine in a circle could be the beating heart of an entire civilization's social life. But to the ancient Greeks, the symposium was more than a party. It was ritual, theatre, education, diplomacy, even confession. a strange blend of structure and abandon, of sacred toast and slurred verse. They poured their wine carefully, but their souls carelessly. Or maybe it was the other way around. If you've made it this far, well done. You've sat through the awkward greetings, survived the sharp banter, sipped your wine without spilling, and maybe even offered a libation or two. You've rubbed elbows with philosophers and flatterers, generals and courtesans, watched power change hands with a raised cup and a clever quote, all without leaving your bed. And if you're still awake, hi there, I hope you're comfy. Maybe you're tucked in, maybe you're stretched out, maybe your eyes are fluttering in that gentle way that means you're halfway to dreaming. If you are, feel free to drift off now. You've earned it. But if your mind's still buzzing just a bit, wondering whether you would have fit in at one of those parties, or whether you'd have been the one quietly slipping out the back before the sixth crater, just know this: most of us wouldn't have handled it well. Not because of the wine or the games or the poetry, but because it was a world so finely tuned to power and perception. A place where every laugh, every glance, every pause could mean something. Where being seen was everything, and being forgotten, a quiet kind of death. Today we drink for fun, for escape, for connection. Back then they drank for all those reasons too, but with rules, with rights, with gods in the room. And if you ever find yourself romanticizing the past, dreaming of togas and toasts and clever repartee by lamplight, remember how much pressure came with that cup, how heavy the wine could be, even when it tasted light. Now take a deep breath. Let your body soften, let your thoughts loosen, let the stories of long-dead men with silver cups and sandal straps fade into the background hum of dreams. Tomorrow we'll go somewhere new together, another strange corner of history, another dusty room filled with voices you've never heard. But for now, it's just you and the quiet, you and the stillness after the music, you and the soft, forgotten rhythm of a party that once echoed through marble halls and olive groves. So close your eyes if you haven't already, and let the ancient world fall away. Sleep well, my friend. And as always, if you're listening from somewhere unexpected, somewhere quiet or beautiful or restless, let me know in the comments. What's keeping you up tonight? Until next time, good night.